Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley with Haley Stitches, and today I'm going to show you how to make a super simple fat quarter quilt. This quilt pattern is a big block quilt pattern, meaning it's just one simple quilt block blown up into a larger size. The quilt block that I'm using for this pattern is called a woven star quilt block, and all you need to make this quilt is 4 fat quarters and 3/4 yard of background fabric. So come with me and let's make this fat quarter quilt together. The first step is to cut your background fabric, and before you cut any strips, make sure that edge is nice and square. And this pattern calls for 10.5-inch wide strips, and most long rulers are only 6 or 6.5 inches wide. So I'm going to show you a little trick. You can use the lines in your cutting mat, but first make sure you use your ruler to make sure they actually are the same size. Sometimes mats can be larger or smaller than your ruler. So as long as your ruler matches up with your mat, you are good to go. From this background fabric, you'll cut 2 10.5-inch strips and 1 6-inch strip. And this pattern calls for exactly 3/4 yard of background fabric. So buy a yard if you're worried about miscuts. Now we're going to trim down that 10.5-inch strip. The first step is to trim off that selvage. Cut a 10.5-inch square using the lines on your mat just like before. And because that strip was folded over, you'll get 2 10.5-inch squares. Next, you can unfold this leftover piece, and from this you'll cut 1 10.5-inch square, again using the lines on your mat, and from this leftover piece you'll cut 1 6-inch square. I'm sure there are rulers wide enough and long enough to cut these 10.5-inch strips and squares, but sometimes I just like using what I have. And I think it's fun to show you guys that you don't need to buy everything. You can just use what's already in your sewing room. Now we're going to cut our second 10.5-inch strip. First, cut off that selvage. And then we are going to cut 2 5.5-inch rectangles, again keeping the fabric folded in half for those cuts. That gives us a total of 4 5.5-inch by 10.5-inch rectangles. And then we're going to unfold this leftover piece, cut 1 10.5-inch square, and from this leftover piece cut 1 more 6-inch square. And lastly, cut the 6-inch strip into a total of 6 6-inch squares. At the end of all that cutting, you'll have 4 10.5-inch squares, 4 5.5-inch by 10.5-inch rectangles, and 8 6-inch squares. Now it's time to cut the fat quarters. You'll need a total of 4 fat quarters for this quilt, and I dug these out of my fabric stash because I'm trying to use what I already have. The first step is to square up your fat quarter. They usually aren't square, so just make sure you have that nice 90-degree angle on the edge to work with. And I just trimmed off a tiny sliver to get the 90-degree angle. And then I'm going to cut it into 2 6-inch strips and 1 5.5-inch strip. I love how there's only a little sliver left. And from there, we'll subcut our first 6-inch strip into 3 6-inch squares. And we'll cut our second 6-inch strip into 2 6-inch squares. You'll have a little bit left over there. And our last 5.5-inch strip we'll subcut down into 3 5.5-inch squares for a total of 5 6-inch squares and 3 5.5-inch squares. And you'll cut the rest of the fat quarters exactly the same. So I'm going to layer them all on top of each other and cut them all at the same time. Just be careful when you're doing this because you don't want to miscut and then cut through all of them incorrectly. Trust me, I know it's happened before. These fabrics have been sitting in my sewing room for well over 2 years, so I'm excited to finally have a project to put them to good use. After cutting, you're going to have all sorts of squares and all sorts of colors, so it's really important to label them to keep them organized. I love these alphabetties. I just put them on with these little clover clips. I'll have it all linked below. I just think they're so convenient. I only have one package, so I labeled the larger squares A through D and then the smaller squares 1 through 4 so I could keep things organized, and then I labeled the background fabric as E just like it is in the pattern. And now we are going to set aside the smaller squares and match up the larger squares into our half square triangle pairings. The pattern has this all laid out in a great table for you, so I'm not going to explain all the pairings, but I liked how it looked, so I left this part in the video. Now it's time to make a half square triangle out of those pairings, so I'm going to quickly do a little refresh on how to do a half square triangle 2 at a time. The first step is to draw a diagonal line on the lighter fabric. You'll pair your fabrics right side together, and then you'll sew a 1/4 inch away from either side of that line. After you've sewn it together, you'll trim along the drawn line, and this will result in 2 identical half square triangles. I love this method. Something about it is so fun to me. I also like the 4 and 8 at a time, but the 2 at a time worked best to make this pattern work with fat quarters. So after you have your two identical half square triangles, we will press to the darker fabric. This is what your half square triangle will look like after it's pressed, and now it is time to trim. So we are going to trim these half square triangles to 5.5-inch squares. And I'm using my rotating mat. I just find this to be a little bit easier when I'm trimming a bunch of half square triangles like this. The most important thing about trimming half square triangles is making sure the diagonal on your ruler lines up with the diagonal on your half square triangle. And then we'll trim off those dog ears. Rotate the mat around. This is the fun part because you don't have to move anything. You can just rotate the mat, and it does save you a lot of time when you're doing like a bunch of half square triangles, but this is definitely something extra. You do not need this in order to make this pattern. I just find it convenient because I work with half square triangles very frequently. So after all of that, you'll end up with two identical half square triangles. So just continue that method for all of the half square triangle pairings until you get every half square triangle needed for this pattern. Now it's the fun part to assemble the rows. So this is the first two rows of the pattern. It can be a little bit tedious laying this one out just because it seems wrong when you're putting it together. So just pay attention to the pattern when you're laying everything out. After you sew these first two rows together, you'll press the top row to the right and the bottom row to the left, and that's going to help make these seams nest so everything stays nice and square. And it'll really be obvious with this pattern if your points aren't matching up. Not that I really care about that a whole lot, but just so you know, if you're using like solid prints like this, it can show up and be very obvious, and you'll see it when I'm piecing this quilt together. Some of my seams do not match up, and honestly, I don't really care, but it is something to pay attention to if you do care about that. So after you piece this middle section, you'll just attach these 10.5-inch squares to either side to finish off that first row. And this is what the finished first two rows pieced together look like. So now I'm going to move on to the next row, which is technically the third row of the pattern. Didn't all fit in one row on my video, so I broke it up into two. But you'll just lay this all out, and for this one, you'll press it all to the right because the previous one was pressed to the left, so it'll help, again, make everything nest and just come together a little bit quicker. And we'll sew this first section to the second section to get kind of the first half of the top there. So you can see it start to come together a little bit. It does, like I said, it looks a little bit wrong. So you'll have to reference the pattern a lot as you're piecing this one together. And here I'm laying out the fourth and fifth rows. So this is that intersection in the middle of the quilt. And this is where you really can see that woven or twist start to happen. And we will just piece this together in little sections to make it easy to piece it all together and make sure those seams don't get too wild and crazy on us. So I'm going to piece this section of 4, this section of 4, and then this section of 4 together to get 3 sections of 4. Then those rectangles in the end we'll piece together last. To help keep our seams and points as neat as possible, we'll press everything from row 4 to the right and everything from row 5 to the left. And again, this is going to help just make our seams nest and make everything come together nicely. Here are those sections of 4 all pieced together, and then we're going to sew them together into one row, and then we will attach those rectangles on the side to get our middle section here. And I like to piece my quilt top together as I go, so I'm going to sew together that first section, the top section with the middle section to get the majority of our quilt pieced together. And this is a fun part. You really start to see it all come together. It's so exciting. Here I'm laying out row 6, and the reason why I'm kind of going quickly through this is because you really do need to reference the pattern for this one, especially if you're using different colors than me. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview here. So here's the piece row 6, and then I will piece together row 7 and 8 the exact same way we pieced together that first section, just kind of upside down and reversed. So you can see even there I'm getting a little bit confused putting all these pieces together, but I promise you can do it, especially if you're following the pattern and have your pieces labeled. That is like key here, is making sure everything is labeled so you know exactly where it goes. For row 7, you'll want to press to the right, and row 8, press to the left to make sure those seams are nesting and all of our points are matching up nicely. And for 7 and 8, you'll just attach these big 10.5-inch squares to either side to finish off the row. And then we will piece these last 2 sections together to our final quilt top, and we have one more seam, and then the entire top is pieced together and we have our final woven star. I love this pattern. I think it is so much fun. It looks super complicated, but it's actually not that bad, especially when it's broken down into these half square triangles. Now, I know you want to head to your sewing room and start making this right away, but if you love this big block quilt tutorial, you are going to love my most popular quilt pattern and quilt video tutorial called Charming Sawtooth. It's made up of half square triangles just like this one, and it's so easy to put together. Watch that video here.